He gave up everything, his wife, his children, his entire life, for a woman he barely knew. Within months, he wasn't living his dream in Tunisia. He was chained in the desert, sold like property by the woman he thought loved him. Mark Turner was the kind of man people described as dependable. He had spent over 20 years working as a mechanical engineer in Manchester, providing a stable home for his wife, Laura, and their 2 teenage children. Life for him had followed a predictable rhythm: work, dinner, sleep, repeat. To outsiders, he had everything a man could want: a loyal family, a steady income, and a quiet home. But beneath that calm surface, Mark was growing restless. The years of routine had carved deep grooves in his spirit, leaving him longing for something more, something that made him feel alive again. When his company assigned him to a short project in Tunisia, he saw it as a welcome change. It was supposed to be 2 weeks of work in the sun, far from the drizzle of northern England. But those 2 weeks would alter the course of his life forever. In Tunis, everything felt different: the light, the air, the way people spoke. It was there that he met Leila, a woman whose beauty carried both innocence and danger. She was younger, vibrant, and mysterious, the kind of person who made ordinary moments feel like scenes from a dream. For the first time in years, Mark felt noticed, admired, even desired. What began as casual conversation soon turned into late-night meetings and whispered promises. When it was time to return home, he hesitated. Back in Manchester, his wife sensed the distance, the growing silence between them. Mark told himself he was just confused, but deep down, he had already made a decision. Within 3 months, he filed for separation, packed a single suitcase, and boarded a flight back to Tunisia. He believed he was chasing love. He had no idea he was walking straight into a trap. Leila was everything Mark had convinced himself he had been missing. She spoke several languages, laughed easily, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that drew attention wherever she went. Her eyes seemed to hold both warmth and mystery, and when she looked at Mark, he felt years younger. She worked in a small boutique near the Old Market, selling handmade jewelry and scarves. She told him stories about growing up near the coast, about sunsets over the desert, and about dreams of owning a guest house by the sea. Mark listened, enchanted, believing every word. To him, Leila represented freedom, the kind he had never dared to chase. When Mark decided to stay in Tunisia permanently, Leila welcomed him with open arms. They rented a small apartment overlooking the crowded streets of La Marsa. The days were bright, filled with laughter, and the nights carried the kind of intimacy that blurred reality. Mark called his children often at first, promising he would visit soon, but over time the calls became less frequent. He told himself they were better off without his confusion shadowing their lives. Leila told him not to dwell on the past, that life was too short for regret. She showed him a world of markets, festivals, and desert adventures. He spent his savings freely, buying gifts for her, paying for dinners, and helping with small expenses. She spoke about starting a business together, something simple, like a travel company for foreign tourists. The idea thrilled him. For once, he felt part of something new, something alive. Every smile from her felt like proof he had made the right choice. What Mark didn't realize was that every moment of happiness he felt was being carefully constructed, piece by piece, by someone who already knew how the story would end. The first signs of trouble appeared so subtly that Mark barely noticed. Leila started coming home late, claiming she was meeting suppliers for their business plans. She began taking private calls on the balcony, her voice low and guarded. When he asked about them, she smiled and said he was being paranoid. Mark wanted to believe her. He had given up everything to be with her, his family, his country, his savings. Doubt, he thought, would only poison what they had built together. But deep inside, something felt wrong. Then, one morning, his bank sent an alert about unusual withdrawals. At first, he assumed it was an error, but when he checked his accounts, thousands of pounds were gone. Leila brushed it off, saying she had used the money to pay advance rent and make business purchases. Mark wanted to be angry, yet she reassured him with a kiss and soft words. He let it go. Over the following weeks, more funds disappeared. His credit card was suddenly declined at a restaurant, and his online banking access was blocked. When he confronted Leila, her tone changed. She told him he was overreacting, that love required trust. Days later, she asked for more money. saying her cousin needed urgent help. When Mark refused, she became cold, distant, and silent. The warmth that once filled their home was replaced by tension. His once bright apartment now felt like a cage. Then, one evening, he noticed his passport missing from the drawer where he always kept it. Leila claimed she had moved it for safekeeping, but her eyes avoided his. Mark felt panic rise inside him for the first time. He tried to shake it off, convincing himself everything was fine. It wasn't. The world he had built around her was quietly collapsing. The morning Leila disappeared, the apartment was eerily quiet. Mark woke to an empty bed and the faint smell of her perfume lingering in the air. At first, he assumed she had gone to the market, but hours passed with no sign of her. The drawers were half open, the closet nearly empty, and his laptop was gone. Panic crept in as he searched the apartment. His passport, credit cards, and phone had all vanished. Only his clothes and a few personal items remained. He rushed downstairs to the building manager, who told him Leila had left late the night before with 2 men carrying suitcases. She had smiled, tipped the guard, and said she wouldn't be back. Mark's first instinct was to go to the police. But at the small local station, officers listened with indifference. They asked for proof she had stolen anything and hinted that maybe he had misunderstood her intentions. To them, it was a matter of personal dispute, not crime. One officer even smirked, saying, "You foreigners fall in love too fast." Frustrated and humiliated, Mark walked out feeling invisible. He tried to contact his bank from an internet cafe, but his accounts were locked due to suspicious activity. Every door seemed to close in his face. His phone line had been disconnected, and his landlord demanded rent he could no longer pay. The dream that once felt like paradise had turned into a nightmare. Mark wandered the streets for hours, searching the markets and alleys where they once walked together, hoping to see her face again. But Leila had vanished completely, leaving behind no trace of her existence. That night, he sat alone in the dark apartment, realizing the full weight of what he had lost, and that no one was coming to help. A week passed before anyone approached him with an offer of help. Mark had been living off scraps of bread and tea, sleeping on a thin mattress in his empty apartment. He had sold his watch for cash and was considering contacting the British embassy when a man appeared near the bus station. He was tall, dressed neatly, and spoke English with a heavy accent. He introduced himself as Kareem and claimed to know Leila. He said she had been trying to reach Mark, but was afraid he was angry. According to Kareem, she wanted to make things right and had sent him to bring Mark to her. The relief that washed over Mark was immediate. Against every instinct, he believed it. Kareem led him to a small car parked nearby, assuring him the meeting place was only a few hours away. As they drove, the city faded behind them, replaced by open land and the vast silence of the desert. Mark began to grow uneasy. The road narrowed. The signal on his phone disappeared, and the driver who joined them halfway through the journey refused to speak. Hours passed under the blistering sun until the vehicle stopped at a remote compound surrounded by dunes. Before Mark could ask questions, Kareem told him to step out. The moment he did, 2 men grabbed him from behind. A cloth covered his eyes, and the sharp scent of gasoline filled his nose. He was dragged into a tent, his wrists bound tightly. Confusion turned to terror as he heard voices arguing in a language he couldn't understand. When the blindfold was removed, all he saw was sand, barbed wire, and the lifeless horizon. He realized then that Leila hadn't sent anyone to save him. She had sent them to deliver him. When Mark regained consciousness, his mouth was dry, and his head throbbed from the heat. He was lying on a dirt floor inside a tent, his hands tied and his ankles raw from the rope. Around him were several men, some young, some old, each bearing the same hollow look of exhaustion. They were prisoners, like him. Through the fabric walls, he could hear the faint sound of generators and distant shouting. The air was heavy with dust and sweat. It didn't take long for him to understand what was happening. He had been sold. Every morning, guards would drag them outside before sunrise. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, and the heat quickly became unbearable. They were forced to dig trenches, carry heavy containers, and construct crude shelters. Some men whispered about smuggling routes, hidden roads used to move weapons, drugs, or people. The guards spoke little, their rifles always within reach. Food was scarce, water rationed, and punishment swift for anyone who disobeyed. Mark tried to stay alive by observing, by keeping quiet. He learned that most of the captives were migrants who had fallen for false promises, jobs, money, or love. Like him, they had been tricked and discarded. Days blurred into nights, and the desert wind howled through the camp like a curse. Occasionally, trucks arrived to drop off supplies or new captives. The faces changed, but the suffering stayed the same. Mark thought constantly about his family, the home he had abandoned, the choices that had led him here. He had traded comfort for chaos, love for illusion. Each sunrise reminded him how far he had fallen from the man he once was. Somewhere deep inside, he still believed he might escape, but every passing day made that belief harder to hold. Back in the city, whispers began to surface about a woman who lured foreign men with promises of love and partnership. Her name was Leila, and her trail of deception stretched far beyond Mark's case. Investigators stumbled upon her name while tracing a series of missing person reports involving European travelers who had vanished after meeting women online. One British tourist, rescued from a smuggling convoy, described a young Tunisian woman who charmed men before handing them over to traffickers. The description matched Leila perfectly. Local authorities, working with an international task force, uncovered fragments of a vast network operating across North Africa. It was a modern form of slavery disguised as romance and opportunity. The scheme targeted lonely, middle-aged men like Mark, who were easier to manipulate. The victims were tricked into draining their finances, then disappeared into remote regions where they were sold to labor camps or criminal groups. Leila's role was crucial. She didn't just recruit. She identified, groomed, and delivered victims to her handlers for profit. Police raided several locations linked to the ring, finding fake passports, stolen credit cards, and photographs of different men posing with Leila. Each photo told the same story: trust, love, and betrayal. But despite multiple arrests, Leila herself was always one step ahead. She moved through cities with ease, changing her name, her appearance, even her accent. Rumors placed her in Libya, then Morocco, then gone entirely. For months, investigators chased leads that led nowhere. Behind closed doors, they admitted the chances of finding her were slim. She was too careful, too smart, and too connected. Meanwhile, in the desert, Mark's life hung by a thread, unaware that the woman who had destroyed him was being hunted, but still free, somewhere out there, planning her next move. By the time months had passed, Mark's body was little more than a shadow of what it once was. His clothes hung loosely from his frame, and the constant exposure to the sun had turned his skin leathery and cracked. Yet somewhere beneath the exhaustion, a spark of survival still flickered. One night, a violent sandstorm swept across the camp, tearing at tents and scattering supplies. Amid the chaos, the guards lost control of their posts. Mark saw his chance. Along with two other captives, one from Sudan and another from Italy, he slipped into the swirling storm, crawling low to the ground until the camp disappeared behind a wall of sand. They moved blindly through the dunes, guided only by instinct and desperation. The air was thick with grit, and breathing felt like swallowing knives. When the storm finally settled, they found themselves alone in a vast sea of emptiness. The men tried to keep moving, but the desert was merciless. Their water was gone within a day, and the heat rose like fire from the ground. On the second day, the Sudanese man collapsed, unable to go on. The Italian begged Mark to leave him, saying they had a better chance if one kept walking. By the third day, Mark stumbled upon a rusted truck half buried in sand. Inside, the air was suffocating, but it offered shade. He rummaged through the dashboard and discovered an old radio transmitter, its antenna bent but intact. It was his only hope. Trembling, he switched it on and pressed the worn-out button, calling for anyone who could hear. Static filled the cabin, then silence, until a faint voice crackled through the noise. Relief flooded him for a moment. But what he didn't realize was that his desperate call had reached people who were not there to save him. The faint signal Mark sent from the radio was picked up hundreds of miles away by a Tunisian border patrol team monitoring smuggling routes. At first, they assumed it was interference, but when the coordinates were traced, it led them to an area notorious for trafficking operations. Within hours, a joint rescue effort was launched involving local police and international forces already investigating Leila's network. As armored vehicles moved through the shifting sands, the rescuers followed faint tire marks and broken debris, clues that pointed toward a hidden encampment deep in the desert. When the raid began, the guards at the camp scattered, firing into the air before fleeing on motorbikes. The captives, weak and terrified, watched as helicopters circled above, the sound of blades slicing through the silence. Mark, barely conscious, was found inside the old truck, clutching the radio. His lips were cracked, and his voice was gone, but when rescuers carried him out, his eyes flickered open. Around him lay other survivors, men who had endured months of forced labor and starvation. Many didn't make it. The authorities dismantled what remained of the camp, recovering documents, weapons, and a small ledger containing transactions that linked directly to Leila's network. The information exposed a wider system stretching across borders, involving corrupt officials and smugglers. Mark was airlifted to a hospital in Tunis, where doctors fought to stabilize him. News of his rescue made international headlines, painting him as the lucky one, the man who survived the desert slave trade. But while the world celebrated, Mark could not. He had escaped physically, but inside, the desert still held him captive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the endless dunes, the faces of those left behind, and the woman who had sold his soul for profit. Mark's recovery was slow and filled with silence. Months passed in the sterile white of the hospital, where nurses came and went, speaking softly as though afraid to break him. His body healed, but the damage inside lingered. The trauma had etched itself into his mind like scars beneath the skin. Every sound of wind reminded him of the desert. Every shadow felt like a warning. When he was finally strong enough to travel, the British embassy arranged for his return home. The flight to London felt endless. He stared out the window the entire time, unable to believe he was alive, unable to accept what his life had become. Back in Manchester, his old house no longer felt like home. His wife had moved on, his children barely spoke to him, and friends treated him like a ghost. The man who had once been a husband, father, and engineer now existed only as a headline. He avoided interviews and turned down documentary offers. The attention felt hollow, like praise for surviving something he wished had never happened. At night, he dreamed of Leila, her laughter, her eyes, the moment she vanished. Sometimes he wondered if she ever thought about him, or if he was just another name on her list. Authorities continued to search for her, tracing false leads across Europe and North Africa, but she always seemed to disappear just before they arrived. Rumors said she had changed her identity, married again, perhaps even started recruiting new victims. For Mark, the uncertainty was worse than closure. He often walked alone along the river near his home, the cold wind cutting through his coat, whispering of things that might never end. He had escaped the desert, but part of him would remain buried there forever.